Good morning and welcome to the Daily Dose. I have before you today several different devices. And as you can see, the one thing that is in common with them, they are powerful devices. They are useful devices. But you know what? They have one thing in common. Whether it's my phone or it's my mouse or it's my slide controller or it's my tablet that I preach from, all of these things are wonderful and they're great unless the battery is drained and you can't use it anymore. When the battery drains, sure, I can recharge it and I can get it recharged and I can handle that. But if the battery's dead when I want it to be useful, it's not useful anymore until such a time as a change is made to recharge and to allow for it to do what it was designed to do. What if we do that spiritually? What if we take the most powerful thing known to mankind and we drain it of its power? This was the great fear of Paul the Apostle. Let's talk about that here in just a second. Well, thank you for joining me this morning on the Daily Dose. As always, this is sponsored by First Baptist Church of Crowley, Texas, and I want to thank you for your support and thank you for being with me on these days, whether it's live or it might even be later. I know several people watch it later, and I appreciate that. If you'd like to get your worship seat reservation, please do so at fbccrowley.org, and we can take care of that there. You can sign up for the 8 o'clock or the 11 o'clock. The weekly update should be coming out today. I got behind schedule a little bit yesterday, so it should be coming out today. I want you to know that we are in a lot of needs. We have needs for help. We are moving some rooms around. We need help with that if you're interested. We need video production help. I need video personality help. I need script help. We need all kinds of things. We're doing so many online things that it takes people to do that. We also are in the midst of training people to work in our tech booth. We have so many opportunities and it's exciting opportunities for you to assist and to help and to be trained up to help us in making Sunday morning happen each and every week. It takes a lot of behind the scenes personnel to do that. And if you're interested in learning or helping, some of these things can even be done remotely. You can work from home. If you would want to do that, we'd love to know that. You can share your interest through fbccrowley.org, and you'll find it in the weekly update where you can click and say, yes, I would like to be a part of that. We also continue to have the 714 challenge. This is based on 2 Chronicles 7:14, where we are praying for the healing from this disease, this pandemic. We are praying for a healing in our nation. We're praying for healing in so many ways. We need to continue to pray for God's presence, for God's Spirit to move in a mighty way among us. And that is affected by and through prayer. And so if you'd like to take the 714 challenge and whether to pray at 7:14 a.m. or p.m. or both, you can do that through the update as well and say, yes, I take the challenge. And I will do that. Several already have. I encourage you to do that. And that challenge continues until we see an end to so many of these things and we can move beyond where we are and what we're doing. Well, welcome to Tuesday. I got a little behind with all the events in my personal life over the weekend. I got a day behind on the reading, and so I was catching up on that reading today. And so I began in 1 Corinthians, and I came across a verse that, I'd read before, but because so often I get focused in on the verses before it, I think somehow in some way I had skipped over this verse on a number of occasions. And so I want to have us look at that. So if you've got your Bible or if you want to get your Bible, we're going to be in 1 Corinthians chapter 1 today, because I want to address a very intriguing verse that I discovered, and the Lord just wants me to speak on that and share that with you this morning. So 1 Corinthians chapter 1 and verse 17, Paul is addressing the divisions that are at Corinth. I'm not going to get into the divisions. That's what happens. I get stuck on how do we have unity and why do they have all these other things. But I want to look and see what he says here. Christ didn't send me to baptize, but to preach the gospel, not with eloquent wisdom. Now look why. Now see, we could get stuck right there, couldn't we? What do you mean you're not supposed to baptize? You're just supposed to preach. What's the point of that? Why would you do one and not the other? Why would you not think that God sent you to baptize, but just to preach? And I think that's important that we each understand the skill set that God's given us. And I also think there's a calling, not only the overall calling that God has called me to vocational ministry. God called Paul to be a missionary, but I think that there are specific guidelines and specific calls that go on through that time. And Paul's like, look, I'm not here just to run up numbers. I'm not here to do the baptizing. I'm not here for you to depend on me to do it all. You already have that problem because some of you belong to Paul or Apollos or Peter or Christ. And he said, you guys already have a problem of just latching on to a human and forgetting that this is a spiritual matter. Why does he say what he says? So that's the why. That's the why. So that he doesn't want to baptize. He wants to preach. He wasn't sent to baptize. He was sent to preach the gospel and to not even do that with a lot of eloquent wisdom. Why? Why would that be? So that the cross of Christ will not be emptied of its effect. And it got me to thinking, how in the world could the cross of Christ ever lose its effect? How could it be emptied of its effect? I mean, this is what God gave. God provided the cross. God provided Jesus. Jesus obeyed the Father and went to the cross, and it is the power of salvation. It is the redemptive nature. It is the sacrifice, the once for all humanity to cover the sins. How could it ever be drained of its power? Well, 5 things came to mind. 1, when we add to the cross what isn't there. When we add to the cross what isn't there, then we are draining the cross of its power. The Judaizers wanted to add circumcision. They wanted to say, okay, hey, you know what? Jesus is awesome. The cross is wonderful, but you have to do Jesus and circumcision. Some denominations in our world today say, you know what? You've got to have faith in Jesus, plus you have to be baptized or you're not really saved. Someone is saying, hey, you know what? Jesus is great. The gospel is awesome. And faith in Jesus is wonderful, but you have to live a perfect life or you can lose that salvation afterward. And that really is creating spiritual drainage of the power, like a battery being drained out. And when it's dead, it's dead. We have to be careful not to drain the cross of its power. Paul was concerned about this. Paul was like, we need to be careful what we're adding or taking away from the effect of the cross. And we need to realize that we don't need to add or take away. The cross is the cross. So how could it ever lose its effect? Well, first of all, when we add to it what isn't there, we can certainly create this kind of issue. Number 2, and this second one is so incredibly important. When the focus is shifted to human, I wrote notes, so here you go. I don't use notes a lot, but I wrote them down. This was off the top of my head this morning as I was reading, and I want to share it with you. When the focus is shifted to humanity, Paul's like, look, people, you all have a problem. You are focusing on this, that, or the other, whether it's me, or whether it's Cephas, or whether it's Apollos, or whether it's Christ himself. You are focusing on humanity. And when we shift the focus from the cross to humanity, and that we are the ones to help you, this becomes a problem. And we've got to be aware. Paul didn't want to use eloquent wisdom or be the one to baptize. Why? So that people wouldn't be dependent on a human. We are called to be dependent upon the presence of the Spirit of God. We are called to be dependent on the Spirit of God. We are not called to be dependent on one another. Now, the one another passages are there. We are to love one another, to bear one another's burdens, to assist and to help one another. But ultimately, we are to rely and be dependent on the Spirit. When we shift that focus from being dependent on the Spirit and Jesus and the cross, and we shift it to humanity, then we have some difficulties. Hey, look, there's a guy, I don't even remember his name. I was messaged this the other day. This guy was on the Sid Roth show. He had a dream about what's coming. And you know what? We got to be careful, because we're shifting our allegiances in the Christian world from Jesus to humanity. We're putting a lot of dependence into humanity. Hey, we should trust our leaders. I get that. Leaders have a call of God. They have the vision of God. They're expressing the vision of God. And, who are we to shut down what God wants to do through the leadership? And yet we do as humans. We say, no, we're not going to do that. We're too afraid to do that. We can't do that. We're going to do that, whatever. And we've just got to be careful that we don't usurp the control of God because of our fears or our lack of trust or our lack of ability, or because we are pandering to humanism, and we're pandering to these kinds of things. When we shift the focus to humanity from the cross, this was Paul's concern. He said, I don't want you to focus on me. I want you to focus on Jesus. I want you to think about Jesus and to contemplate Jesus and the cross and the power of the cross. And I don't want to drain the effects of the cross simply because I have an ego problem, Paul may have had, or you have to place this faith. I mean, we just have to be careful. That's when the focus shifts to humanity. We have to be careful that we're not draining the power and we're not experiencing spiritual drainage. Okay, number 3, when division creates a problem because the focus, we're divided because of sin. We divide ourselves because of sinful things. Paul will talk about later in chapter 1 and on into chapter 2, actually. He comes back to the point in chapter 3 when he refers back to these divisions. He said, this is, the cross of Christ is foolishness to the people. Why? Because we don't understand it. Because we'd never have done that. We wouldn't do that. But more importantly, when those who should be mature aren't mature, there's a lack of development, physically mature, spiritually lacking in maturity and development. He said this creates problems because we are relying on ourselves, or we are being worldly, and we are creating our own problem when we are not maturing in the way that we should spiritually. We're draining the cross of its effect, because essentially, if I come to the cross, if I come to Jesus and I recognize my sin, and I recognize that what Jesus did on the cross was the sacrifice required to cover that sin, but then I go about my life and I continue to live worldly, this is the conundrum, this is the question of the ages. Is a person really saved if they're living that way? And there's all kinds of theological implications with that. But you know how easy it is it's so easy to get entrenched in that. It's so easy to use spiritual language and spiritual terms, but be coming at it from a worldly perspective. And we have to be cautious and careful. If we want power and strength and hope in our life today, then we have to not be draining the spiritual power because of our lack of trust or faith or maturity in our own lives. So when we have divisions among us, it can cause problems because our witness will then be lacking to the world around us. If a church or a group is divided, everybody around it knows that, and then the effectiveness of the gospel presentation is lessened, and in effect, it is the cross of Christ being emptied of its effect. Whether it is the personal effect, the cross of Christ was supposed to and does completely redeem us, set us on a new pathway in a new way with a new life, and that is what happens. That's the effect. That's what it does. But if our life a year, 2 years, 15, 20 years later doesn't show any development and doesn't show any movement and maturity in this process, then the people that are looking for help and salvation and seeking that are going to say, yeah, but it never changed you, really. So why should I investigate it? That's emptying the cross of its effect. And we have to be careful with that. When we lose our faith, that when we lose sight of our faith, we can empty the cross of its power. Paul would say later on, in verse 22, the Jews ask for signs and the Greeks seek wisdom, but we preach Christ crucified. So there's three things there, right? There's three things there. The Jews want proof. They want proof. They're not wanting to walk by faith. They want proof. For them, circumcision had always been proof. They want a sign. And they say, okay, Jesus is great, but we need Jesus and this, or this. And Paul's like, that's not the point. We preach Christ and him crucified. We're not going to give you a bunch of signs. We're not going to say that it's Jesus plus or Jesus and. You've got to have faith in the power of the cross, the process of salvation, the pathway that's been given. You've got to have faith in it, and the Jews struggle with that. On the other side, the Greeks want wisdom. They want to think their way through it. And you can't logic your way through salvation. It's illogical. It is not logical that the divine would sacrifice themselves for the fallen. Why would the divine do that? And in Greek's life and in Greek mythology, they have no concept of this. They don't understand it. So they're seeking wisdom and philosophy and logic and the logos. And Paul's like, Greeks want wisdom. They, in essence, are struggling with faith. And he's telling the church, don't go that direction. Don't go back. Don't fall back into that trap of I've got to have proof or I've got to have wisdom or all these. He said, you've got to walk by faith. You've got to take steps of faith that may not be logical, and it may be fearful, and it may be problematic, but we have to take steps of faith. And he says, look, we preach Christ and him crucified. It's a stumbling block to the Jews because they want a sign. It's foolishness to the Gentiles because they're like, look, why would the divine ever do that? I can't imagine. And so they can't imagine what's going on. Neither want to step out in faith to have a better future. They want to have complete comfort. They want to have all their questions answered. They want to have everything right there in front of them. And that is not how God operates in our life. We take steps of faith into the unknown, into the uncomfortable, into the inconvenient, and that's where God is 99% of the time. He's in the uncomfortable, inconvenient spot and the unknown. We can't see it because he's already seen it. And he says, do you trust me? Will you follow me? Will you go with me? The Jews want a sign. The Greeks want wisdom. And Paul sits in the middle saying, it's about faith. We preach Christ, him crucified. That's all it is. That's all it's going to be. And that's why so many of you are stumbling. And he's raising that as an issue. And the last thing is, and I touched on this earlier, but when we don't mature as we should, and we live in a worldly fashion, he addresses that later in chapter 3, that when we don't mature, physically we're maturing, but if spiritually we're not maturing, then we have a problem. And actually, we're going to get into that this Sunday morning when we go over to 2 Peter and we talk about having skin in the game. You got to put yourself into it. You've got to set yourself to absorb some of the risk. And if we as followers of Christ want all the benefits without any of the risks, can we say that we're truly living by faith? If we say no, until I can have all the answers laid out in front of me, until I can have all my fears assailed, until I can have all of these things laid out so that I can have complete control over what's going to happen, are we really living by faith? If we have to say, no, I got to have all my answers before me. I can't leave any any question unanswered. I've got to have all these things, and you have to lay it all out for me, or I can't make a decision. The question then is begged, am I really living by faith? Or am I going back into an immature decision that says, no, it's not about faith. It's about my comfort. It's about my logic. It's about answering all of these things. And I'm not going to step out into the unknown. I'm not going to go into the uncomfortable. I'm not going to go into the inconvenient. When we do that, we're draining the cross of its effect. This is not what Jesus died for. This is not why Jesus died. Jesus died to give you a new life. Jesus died to give you a new hope. Jesus died to give you a new pathway to walk by faith that is a stumbling block to the Jews. It's foolishness to the Greeks. But to those on this side of the cross, it is life, it is power, it is joy, it is blessed states of living. And we must continue to take steps of faith and to go out into the unknown, to go into the inconvenient and say, because of the call of God, because of the cross of Christ, for the kingdom's sake and for the cause, I will continue to walk. Even though I don't know exactly what's going to happen, I don't exactly know what's on the other side of this door, this wall, this mountain, this window, this thing in front of me. I don't exactly know when COVID's going to end. I don't exactly know when life goes back to quote unquote normal. I don't exactly know how that's going to live, but I know this, that Jesus died for me so that I could exhibit a faithful presence in an unfaithful world, that I can exhibit a faith process in a culture that is seeking it and don't even know it. May we, as followers of Christ, be faithful to Christ. May we not be the ones that are draining the cross of its effect because of a variety of things that I've mentioned today. May we continue, I beg you, let us walk by faith and see God work in our hearts and in our lives. Put some skin in the game, accept, absorb the risk as well as the reward, and watch God bless us in our faithfulness this day and in the days ahead. Have a great Tuesday, and we'll see you again tomorrow.